Lead Me Winter Training School Madrid 2021. Media Accessibility Training, Sign Language and Subtitling for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. Organised by the Trapezius Research Group and AVLA project at Complutense University Madrid.
First of all, thank you, Juan Pedrica, for organizing this successful winter school, and let me be taking part in it and sharing this space with amazing professionals and big names in the field. Okay, so as you can see, I'm going to talk about the unknown facts behind sign language interpretation, but I'm going to introduce myself a little bit first. My name is Raúl Rodríguez, and I'm a second-year PhD student. I'm an English and language teacher, and I work in a school. I'm also a sign language interpreter, although I don't work as an interpreter for a living. However, I do collaborate with different artists, interpreting songs in concerts or different types of events, so that I can promote not only sign language, but the profession itself, which I consider it to be a very beautiful one. Okay, we have the index here, so I'm going to go through a brief introduction about my experience and how I got there. And then I divided these presentations into two main sections or blocks. The first one is the interpreter requirements. The second one is the musculoskeletal injuries. And the last one is the role of an interpreter. So let's begin with the introduction. My path to the sign language started with my uncle, who became deaf at 4 years of age when he suffered from meningitis. He was an appealing mystery to me. I was scared of him at first because he was so loud and I wasn't able to understand him. But at the same time, I had this attraction to his hands moving, releasing words that I couldn't catch. Then I realized that I had to study the language somehow. But when I found out that there was a profession related to it, I always had it in my mind. Finally, I became an interpreter almost 10 years ago, and I must confess that it was way much more difficult for me to finish my sign language interpretation studies than my English degree. Okay, so according to the National Deaf Center, the role of the sign language interpreter appears to be very straightforward to effectively facilitate communication between deaf individuals and those who are hearing. So we are basically a bridge between the deaf community and the hearing community. It's plain and simple. But nevertheless, the complexities of the mission, the injuries that interpreting may cause, and the working situation, the heterogeneity of the deaf community, and the ignorance of society make it anything but simple. So here we have the, let's see if I can, okay. Here we have the requirements for an interpreter. The first one is the high level of fluency in 2 languages, not only formal register we are talking about, but also informal, as every user is quite different and comes from a different background. Sometimes interpreters must adapt their vocabulary or rephrase, as there are many old users who don't understand modern signs or are not able to follow long sentences. We often think of the deaf person as the requester of the interpreter service, but the reality is that all parties have an equal and mutual need for the interpretation, or for the interpreter in this case. And the second one is a good command of linguistics, such as syntax or semantics. Language do not follow oral language's patterns or structure. Sign language is a visual, gestural language, so facial expression plays an important role in interpretation, because numerous words need to be reinforced by expression, and the structure is quite different, as in sign language, verbs are normally placed at the end of the sentence, and not every preposition or conjunction must be signed. The complexity of this structure when it comes to interpreting is that we have to remember that verbs in long sentences to place them at the end. Sometimes we forget that. And this will increase the level of stress of the interpreter. Then next one, a broad-based word knowledge. This includes geography, celebrities of famous people from your country and around the world. As in any simultaneous interpretation, the interpreter must have a wide knowledge of different areas and a good command of many other topics, such as, for example, politics or society, economy, history, and so on. This is really important because in any live event, even though we know the topic or we have the content in advance, something else out of the blue could come up. No matter how scripted the event is, nobody can control what a speaker says at any particular time. So due to the complexity of interpreting a live event, organizers and speakers are asked to hand the content of their intervention in advance so that the interpreter can prepare the interpretation, looking for the signs for specific or vocabulary such as neologism or toponyms and so on. Otherwise, the interpreter will have to spell in sign language any other unknown words that may appear, which will provoke a little bit more of a stress and delay to the interpreting situation, as both neologisms and toponyms are created by deaf people and spread thanks to the use they make of them. So these are some of the reasons why a sign language interpreter must be as prepared as possible in terms of word knowledge. And the more the interpreter knows and controls, the better the interpretation will be. Then this is an important fact, high control of emotions. A sign language interpreter requires a high control of emotions because his or her body is needed for the process of interpretation. As you know, facial expression is one of the keys of the language. Any misleading expression showing any other emotion could mean just the opposite, or if repeated and in control, could turn the interpretation into something that it's not. In order to perform a good interpretation, the interpreter's body must stand still, arms loose, and in order to form the signs properly, and calm appearance, so that the whole body is ready to carry out the interpretation. Logically, from here, it is really easy to say this when you are not an interpreter, when you're not interpreting, but we have to control our body and do not show any emotion that is not implicit in the interpretation. And this is a really difficult task to execute. Okay, next we're going to the attention and the concentration capacity of the interpreters. And interpreters must have keen ability to focus on what is being said. And attention is one of the keys of interpretation, as one slight distraction can provoke a chain of mistakes very difficult to amend. That's why concentration is quite relevant too. There are some factors that influence how long one interpreter can interpret without experiencing not only stress or lack of concentration, but also mental or physical fatigue. And in conferences, for example, or in long events, a team of 3 interpreters is always needed to mitigate overuse injuries. We're talking about in a minute about it, and interpretation errors. Due to the limited capacity of human brain to keep concentration for long periods of time, team interpreting should be the option. For example, in a conference or an hour-long class should be teamed. When working in teams, the first interpreter will be interpreting for 20 minutes. From that moment, concentration will start to decrease. The second interpreter will be placed right in front of him or her, and to give signs when they're needed, or to correct the interpreter if a mistake has been made, and even to help if the interpreter loses one sentence or doesn't know how to go on with the sentence. And the third interpreter will be resting next to the second one, and they will take turns and move around until the work is finished. And the last one is professional and ethical conduct. According to WASLI, the World Association of Sign Language Interpreters, have developed their own code of ethics or code of professional conduct, which embodies those values and sets out how interpreters are expected to behave when they're interpreting. In Spain, we follow the Código Deontológico y de Buenas Prácticas de APTIC, but every country has developed its own. Most of them share the same values, which are going to see now, but it depends on the country, and they may change. The first one is going to be confidentiality. Interpreters or members must maintain confidentiality at all times, in and out of the interpreting situation. This is very important. And treat any information which may come to them in the course of their work as privileged information that they will not obtain otherwise, not to be communicated into to a third party without authority ever. Then the second one is the personal benefit, as no member shall derive any gain from privileged information acquired in the course of work undertaken or accept remuneration in respect of work other than as contractually agreed. This one is very important too. Then impartially, members shall interpret impartially between the various parties to ensure complete and effective communication, including intervention to prevent misunderstanding and incorrect cultural references, which sometimes is very difficult to manage. Apart from these ones, there could be different ones relating to, for example, comradeship between interpreters or professionalism. So it is really important to fulfill this code of ethics in order to standardize and dignify not only the role of the interpreter, but the profession itself. It is not easy to execute it sometimes, because there are situations in which the interpreter must make the right decision in order to be true to the code. But however, we took an oath and we have to stick to it. Okay, so let's move to the next block, which is going to be a little bit intense, but I think it's very important to talk about the injuries that we could suffer. Sign language interpreting is one of the highest risk professions for ergonomic injury. In the Rochester Institute of Technology in 2008, cataloged the effect on signing on interpreters and showed a correlation between mental and cognitive stress, which increased ergonomic risk. This team found out that wrist velocity and acceleration during interpreting, all these factors used to measure physical impact, were more acute than the high-risk limits for industrial workers, for example. In addition, an increase in mental and cognitive stress led to 15 up to 19% increase in wrist velocity and acceleration during interpreting. The hand shapes required for sign language often cause interpreters to contort their hands and twist in very awkward and strenuous positions. So sign language alphabets usually requires the wrist extension for some of the letters, and they are all signed one after the other to form a word. So when finger spelling, the wrist is held in an extended position. I'm not sure if you have seen this before, but the hand must be just like this, and we have to spell all the different words as quickly as we can, but not forgetting that the deaf person on the other side have to understand what we are saying. So this is very important in order to understand how injuries can be caused. And as the pace of the communication among users of the language is quick and fluid, sign language interpreters in particular are often subjected to an accelerated pace when interpreting. Ergonomics in sign language interpretation must be taken very, very seriously, as there is a highly important risk implied here. While signing, an interpreter not only uses fingers, as I've said before, but also hands or arms. We use almost every part of our body as we are standing all the time. When we are studying the profession, there is at least one subject that deals with the importance of ergonomics, and how a repetitive poor posture can affect different parts of our bodies and cause some injuries that we're going to see in a couple of minutes. So warming up, a correct back position and working with less stress as possible can avoid some of these injuries. However, it's not as easy as it seems, because it is true that most of the injuries affect arms and shoulders too. So to have an idea of the complexity of this dark side of the interpretation, I wanted to pay attention to these two pictures. I'm not sure if you can read anything out of them, but still, we have a lot of things going on in our hands and in our arms. Probably we don't even know the name of all these muscles, tendons, and ligaments, but they are there, and every time we move or we make the slightest move, we are moving basically all of them. So there's a high risk. So this is why I wanted to understand what's going on inside our hands, and that's why the power is here. Okay, so let's move to another one. So according to Flegrand, I think it's here. Yeah, the human hand is capable of producing a seemingly infinite number of different movements. Though these movements seem straightforward, even the simplest flexion or extension of a single finger requires immense coordination and integration of the action of several different muscles. We obviously take this for granted, as we are not aware of the body parts implied in every movement we make, no matter how basic it is or it seems. So in order to minimize the size of the hand, extrinsic muscles originating in the forearm produce much of its movement. Thus, it is vital to have a working knowledge of the basic anatomy and the musculature of the upper extremity, namely the forearm, wrist, and hand. So, according to Grad in 1998, the hand is controlled by 21 different muscles, in addition to the 19 comparably smaller intrinsic muscles that originate within the hand itself. The forearm is divided by the frontal plane into two compartments, the anterior and the posterior. portions containing the flexors and extensors respectively, which were the ones that we saw in the image before. And I'm not an expert in myology, but every time we move a finger, there are many muscles, nerves, and tendons implied. So it is no surprise that these apparently easy movements can provoke in a long term. So now I'm going to introduce the most common musculoskeletal injuries that a sign language interpreter can suffer. The first one, we have 9. The first one is the carpal tunnel syndrome. This is one of the most important ones. And you have here, okay. So it's a common condition that causes pain, numbness, and tingling in the hand and arm. The condition occurs when one of the major nerves to the hand, the medial nerve, it is called, is squeezed and compressed as it travels through the wrist. According to several professionals, as Stead, well, you have there, so Stead, Feuerstein et al. And Smith et al. Carpal tunnel syndrome has been documented frequently among sign language interpreters. Feuerstein and Fitzgerald in 1992 examined the biomedical factors associated with sign language interpreting that increase the risk of developing this illness. They performed a study comparing interpreters with pain related to their work and interpreters without pain. The results suggest that the combination of the velocity, repetitive and continuous motion, and awkward and forceful hand deviations from the neutral position contribute to the development of such disorders. This also suggests that the signing styles, for example, velocity, fluency, fluidity, repetition of signs, rest breaks, and so on of individuals play a large role in the development of the carpal tunnel syndrome. The second one, which is probably one that you know about, is that it's called tendonitis. Tendonitis is an irritated or inflamed tendon. You have it here in the picture. And tendons are the bands of tissue that connect muscles to bones and help the body to move. So tendonitis can develop in many places in the body, but the most common ones for a sign language interpreter are the shoulder, the elbow, and the wrist. It can be a dangerous injury because the tendon gradually deteriorates due to overuse or repetition, which provokes a chronic tendinitis. Then, because tendons play such a large role, let's see, we have it here, such a large role in the generation of tension, they are frequently site of irritation. And the interpreter discovers tendonitis when the tendons are already damaged. So injuries like this are not easy to heal. We have 2 types, you have them there. Tendonitis in the shoulder, which is an inflammation of the rotator cuff or biceps tendon, and tendonitis in the wrist. As with carpal tunnel syndrome that we saw before, tendons running through the wrist are subjected to frictional forces resulting from repetitive movement within the wrist itself. These tendons, at the same time, are in areas of high friction or medical stress, as well as repetitive and excessive mechanical stress placed upon the tendons, which ultimately leads to irritation and inflammation surrounding the tendon, according to Kahn et al. In 1999. So tendonitis in the wrist is caused by frequent and rapid movements of the hands and wrist associated to sign language. The third one that we have here is lateral epicondylitis, or it's commonly known as tennis elbow. It's a very common painful condition affecting the lateral region of the elbow. We have it here in the picture somewhere. There you go. And the classical interpretation of lateral epicondylitis has been that chronic overuse of the elbow joint causes micro tears in the common extensor tendon that continually heal and pull apart, causing chronic inflammation. As the elbow is a frequent site of irritation among sign language interpreters, as it serves as the origin for the wrist extensors, and sign language interpreters often required the wrist to be extended while contorting the fingers into very awkward positions, and can provoke this pain because the movement of the fingers are not natural ones. We force them to change from one sign to another. So the configuration of the hands, it's not always the same, and it's not a natural one. Then the fourth one is the medial epicondylitis, and this is the golfer's elbow. And is characterized by pain from the elbow to the wrist on the inside, which is the medial side of the elbow. The pain is caused by damage to the tendons that bend the wrist towards the palm. So a tendon is a tough cord of tissue that connects muscles to bones. So forceful and repetitive occupational movements while signing provoke it in most of the cases. Then the fifth one is epicondylitis, and in the case of the previous one, the epicondylitis, it is due to the inflammation of the anchorage of the tendons or of the flexors of the wrist and of the pronator muscle on the inner side of the elbow. It is less frequent, that epicondylitis, but that occurs on the external side of the elbow. So typically appears in people who make repeated effort, just like us. And the sixth one is the, we have here the Trapezius Myalgia, which is the complaint of pain, stiffness, and tightness of the upper trapezius muscle. It is characterized by acute or persistent neck shoulder pain, and it's very common in monotonous jobs with highly repetitive work, forceful exertions, and high level of static contractions, prolonged static loads, constrained work posture, or a combination of all these factors are possible cause for of neck and shoulder disorders in the working population, which is directly or indirectly related to the interpretation of sign language interpreters. And the seventh one, it's not a very common one. It's called the Quervain's syndrome, and it's a painful condition that affects tendons where they run through a tunnel on the thumb side of the wrist. There is little evidence that it is caused by work activities, but the pain can certainly be aggravated by hand used at work when interpreting. And we have here the arthritis. Arthritis is a very famous one, and one of the consequences of arthritis, or the causes in this case, is sign language interpretation. Arthritis literally means joint inflammation. Although joint inflammation is a symptom or sign rather than specific diagnosis, the term arthritis is often used to refer to any disorder that affects the joints. Joints are placed where two bones meet, such as your elbow or your knee. And in the case of an interpreter, arthritis affects fingers after some time working, as it is a disease that is caused when joints are affected by overuse. And the last one is the trigger finger. The trigger finger is a condition in which one of your fingers get stuck in a bent position. Your finger may bend or straighten with a snap, like a trigger being pulled and released. People whose work or hobbies require repetitive gripping actions, like in sign language, for example, they have a higher risk of developing trigger finger. So let's move for the role of an interpreter, which is the last part. Here I'm going to focus in the figure of the sign language interpreter because it has increased over time in the last decade. Nevertheless, there are many factors and facts that we must face as interpreters on a daily basis that a large part of society, they continuously skip. So it is well known that we wear black, as you can see me in the picture, in order to make our hands and movements more visible. We wear no watches while we are working or jewelry during interpretations due to distraction issues. But what else can we say apart from the obvious? So there are two main areas to cover when it comes to the kind of job of the profession of the sign language interpreter. First one, we work between two worlds. The first one is the services world, and the other one is the education world. We are trained to be able to execute well in both, but at the same time, they are quite different, and we always prefer one of both. And so let's focus on the first one, which is education. So in education covers every interpretation that takes place in educational institutions, such as high school or a university, a language school, and so on. Furthermore, extracurricular activities on even courses taking place outdoors, for example, gardening, a gardening course. And these interpretations can take from one session event up to a whole calendar year. The content or materials should be provided in advance, but sometimes they are handed even the day before or a couple of days before the interpretation, which, depending on the topic or the type of work, it might not be enough. So in Spain, interpretations of subjects in school or universities are paid by government grants. These grants are provided by the council every year, and the quantity of money provided may change every time, so that not all needs are covered every year. In fact, it happens quite the opposite. Sometimes there are more school sessions to interpret than interpretation hours. In these cases, the user and the interpreter analyze which subjects are more relevant and prioritize the most difficult ones or the ones that the user find hard to understand. But situations like this provoke inequality and a lack of opportunities that a hearing student has for granted. And a deaf student must fight and work very hard in order to achieve good results. This is one of the reasons why very few deaf students make it to the university. If they do, if they're lucky, they will have to choose the subjects they want to try to pass that year and leave the rest for the following years, or try to pass the subject without an interpreter, which is quite a hazard for them. For the interpreter, long courses like this can be very stressful because a good preparation of a very difficult subject, for example, math since high school or any specific university subject, depends on the teacher or professor's material provided in advance. When there is no handed material at all, the situation turns into an enormous challenge for the interpreter, and they will have, or we will have to manage to interpret complex content, specific vocabulary, or even everlasting theoretical sessions on any topic without any previous preparation. So when it comes to any other type of training or education, there are no grants. So the deaf person will have to ask for an interpretation service in the Sign Language Interpreter Center of his or her town, usually called Deaf People Association or a foundation, in which they will have to pay for the service provided. In this particular case, the materials are provided, obviously, and handed in advance thanks to the pressure of the association, which asks them the minute the user wants to sign in the course, which is way more easier for the interpreter. And the last part, it's the other world that we move in, which is services. It covers a very broad and diverse range of interpreting situations, from medical appointments up to legal citations. Everything that a deaf person needs to solve or arrange in society will be included here. It may seem simple for a sign language interpreter to go with the user to the unemployment office, for example, to sign up there, or to fill a document and ask for a grant, but the situation there can be a little bit more challenging and complex. In order to explain real interpretive situation, I'm going to describe an example of interpreting situation that we have gone through as interpreters. It doesn't mean that all of the situations proceed the same way, but sometimes different and difficult issues happen, and we finally solve them thanks to our experience and knowledge, but it's a bit difficult. I'm going to finish with my presentation, I'm going to explain how it would be a real medical appointment. So I meet my user at 9 o'clock in the morning outside the health center because she has a medical appointment. We're going to call this user Alisa. So I don't know her. This is the first time I'm going to work with her, and the information I've received by the Deaf People Association and a colleague that has interpreted her before is that she's 50 years old. Her signing is more or less clear, and the medical appointment is with the gynecologist. So I finally meet her and we introduce each other. I ask her if she wants me to spell the names outside in the waiting room every time the doctor or nurse calls for someone. This will mean to stand near the nurse and spell every name she says. Fortunately, users are not interested in this, and they only want us to let them know when they are called, because otherwise we'll be hell. In the waiting room, I try to gather information about her appointment. Why is she there? Her medical record, or anything relevant that may help me in my interpretation. This will also make her sign so that I can analyze a little bit her way of signing, as everyone signs in a different way, as you know. So when I say this, I mean that we all sign the same things, but we all execute things differently, depending on the physical condition, the age of the user, how fast or slow they sign, and even how they put together all the signs. It is quite common that users don't finish some signs and start making new ones altogether, which could complicate things a little, even though we are used to. Now is when external factors take action. These external factors basically are how the user, in this case Alisa, is keen to provide the information that I need, and how much time we spend in the waiting room. Sometimes, very important, it's to know that I always say that the user before starting is that please, she must introduce me to the doctor in this case. And you will wonder why? Because the doctors, well, not only doctors, but everyone, think that I'm a relative of hers, and the situation can be a little awkward. So we are the doctors, and my job starts. I only interpret what the doctor says and what Alisa signs, nothing else. I stand right next to the doctor and in front of Alisa for her to see me well. Some scenarios can happen at that moment. The first one, the best scenario, Alisa introduces me as her interpreter and everything is fine. Second scenario, Alisa forgets or refuses, it happens, to introduce me and the doctor seems confused by my placing and speaks in third person as if she was an outsider. So I will have to interpret in third person when the doctor speaks and in first person when Alisa signs. So this could be confusing because the doctor may think that I'm talking about myself. You will think that it's not logical, but it has happened to me. So, and the third scenario is that Alisa forgets or refuses to introduce me and the doctor asks finally why I'm placed next to him and why I speak in the first person. So Alisa then will have to explain who I am and the role I play here. Obviously, I'm not allowed to interrupt or add anything as I have a code of ethics that doesn't allow me. So after that, there may be another issue when the doctor must check on or auscultate Alisa, as she wouldn't want a man interpreter that she doesn't know or trust to see her naked. The doctor will use a screen to cover what is happening and indirectly will cut all communication. So again, two scenarios. The first one, the doctor knows what he's doing because it has happened before and wait until the end of the auscultation to diagnose for me to interpret. Second one, the horrible one, and the doctor starts speaking about what he sees and all the information is gone because of the screen situation. So in this particular situation, what I do, even though it is not really the right way to proceed, is ask him if he could please wait a second until I can interpret again because we can see each other. So I intervene here to avoid a waste of time and because I consider relevant that the doctor should be aware of the communication process. Otherwise, the doctor will keep on speaking. And when the user is fully dressed again and asks for her diagnosis, the doctor will probably say, I already say her, just tell her. And that is not the job of an interpreter. So if we are already out of the health center and the user asks me for information that has been said before, I won't tell her because I'm not the doctor and I can make a mistake. So the solution is to go back and ask again, just like any one of us will do in that situation. So our goal here as interpreters is that the deaf user doesn't miss any of the information, that wherever she goes, she can have addresses, directions, medications, doses, and so on written down in paper right from the professional, not from me. She needs to ask the questions she wants and she's the owner of her own time. And she has to take advantage of having an interpreter to complete her mission, just like hearing people would do when we go to an important appointment. It is really relevant for us that our job as interpreters is well known everywhere we go in order to work in the best conditions. We don't ask for any special treatment. We just want people to let us work and don't interfere, not even indirectly, in our interpreting situation. So, well, as you can see, this is a very rewarding profession we have after all, but it has a negative side that I wanted to show somehow here. We just want the world to be aware of what we do, who we are, and how we do it. So thank you very much for your attention and patience, and I will gladly answer any questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Raúl.
Very welcome.
Presentation, very interesting, and wow, I've got actually a lot of questions for after your presentation. Let me stop the recording.
Cost. European Cooperation in Science and Technology. This video is based upon work from Cost Action Lead Me CA 19142, supported by COST. COST is a funding agency for research and innovation networks. Our actions help connect research initiatives across Europe and enable scientists to grow their ideas by sharing them with their peers. This boosts their research, career and innovation. www.cost.eu. This work is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution CC BY, funded by the Horizon 2020 Framework Programme of the European Union.